Get on your knees right now. Officer Daniel Briggs' voice tore through the quiet neighborhood like a siren cutting open the middle of the night. Red and blue lights flashed across the rain-soaked windows of Maplewood Drive, turning neat suburban homes into trembling shadows beneath the glow of 10 police cruisers lined bumper to bumper along the curb. Porch lights flicked on one by one up and down the block as curtains shifted and frightened faces peeked through narrow openings. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked nonstop. Naomi Carter stood frozen just inside her front doorway, one hand gripping the edge of the frame so tightly her knuckles turned pale beneath her brown skin. She had been asleep less than 20 minutes earlier after finishing a 14-hour shift at the Veterans Trauma Center downtown. Her loose gray sweatshirt still carried the faint scent of hospital disinfectant and burnt coffee from the overnight nurse's station. Barefoot against the cold hardwood floor, she stared at the impossible sight outside her home. Flashlights swept across her lawn. Officers in tactical vests moved between the cruisers with rigid urgency, radios crackling sharply through the humid North Carolina air. One of them pointed toward her porch the moment the front door cracked open. Visual confirmed. The officer barked into his shoulder. Naomi's heart pounded once, hard enough to hurt. Behind her, deeper inside the small house, she heard the weak, rattling cough of her father struggling awake in his bedroom. That sound hit her harder than the police lights. "Ma'am, step outside now," Briggs shouted again through the loudspeaker mounted on the cruiser roof. "Hands where we can see them." Naomi swallowed carefully and stepped onto the porch in thin cotton pajama pants and house slippers, the wet night breeze brushing against her skin. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Across the road, a little boy pressed his face against a second-floor window while his mother pulled him gently back from the glass. Naomi slowly raised her hands chest high, not out of fear, but because she already understood how quickly fear could become misunderstanding. Officer Briggs climbed out of the lead cruiser with the slow confidence of a man completely certain he controlled the night. Tall, broad-shouldered, white, somewhere in his late 40s, he adjusted his tactical gloves while studying Naomi like she was already guilty of something. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap onto the pavement as he walked toward the front gate. "Naomi Carter?" he asked sharply. "Yes," she answered softly. "Where is he?" Briggs demanded. Naomi blinked once. "I don't know who you mean." Briggs gave a humorless smile that never reached his eyes. "Funny thing about people who hide fugitives," he said. "They always pretend to be confused first." Murmurs spread among the officers behind him. Naomi glanced back toward the hallway inside the house, where another coughing fit echoed weakly through the darkness. "My father's sick," she said quietly. "Please lower your voices." Briggs ignored her completely. "We have reason to believe an armed Navy SEAL deserter entered this residence less than an hour ago." The neighborhood seemed to freeze. Even the barking dog stopped. Naomi stared at him, stunned now not by fear, but disbelief. "You've got the wrong house," she said carefully. Briggs stepped closer to the gate, boots splashing softly against the wet sidewalk. "That's not your decision to make tonight." Naomi slowly stepped down from the porch, the wet wooden stairs creaking softly beneath her slippers while flashing police lights painted moving shadows across her face. The air smelled like rain, gasoline, and overheated engines. Officer Briggs stood waiting near the open gate with both hands resting calmly on his duty belt, his expression unreadable beneath the spinning red and blue reflections crossing his jawline. Behind him, officers spread across the small front yard, scanning windows, rooftops, and neighboring fences as though they expected danger to appear from thin air. Naomi stopped at the edge of the walkway and kept her hands visible exactly where they could see them. She had spent years calming traumatized veterans in emergency rooms at 3 o'clock in the morning. She knew what panic looked like. She also knew how quickly authority could mistake composure for defiance. "You are making a mistake," she said carefully. Briggs tilted his head slightly. "That is not what our intel says." Naomi looked past him toward the line of police vehicles crowding the narrow suburban street. Maplewood Drive had never looked like this before. Kids rode bicycles here during summer evenings. Elderly couples walked tiny dogs after dinner. Last Christmas, Naomi herself had helped string lights across Mrs. Patterson's porch 2 houses down after the old woman slipped on ice and hurt her hip. Now the same neighbors watched silently from behind curtains as tactical officers surrounded her home like it belonged to someone dangerous. The thought made her chest ache more than the humiliation itself. Another cough echoed faintly from inside the house. Longer this time. Weaker. Naomi glanced toward the front door on instinct. Briggs noticed immediately. "Who else is inside?" he asked sharply. "My father," Naomi answered. "He has Parkinson's disease. He can barely walk without assistance." Briggs studied her for a long moment as rain tapped softly against the hoods of the cruisers around them. Somewhere down the block, thunder rolled low through the clouds. "You live alone with him?" he asked. "Yes." One younger officer standing nearby shifted uneasily. Naomi recognized the expression immediately. Doubt. Not toward her. Toward the situation itself. Briggs, however, remained coldly focused. "You work at Veterans Trauma Center downtown?" he asked. Naomi nodded once. "Night shift. Convenient place to meet military personnel." The accusation hung in the humid air between them. Naomi stared at him, exhausted now more than angry. Her dark curls still clung damply around her face from sleep, and faint purple circles rested beneath her eyes after another endless hospital shift filled with anxious families and restless patients. She had spent the past 6 years lifting wounded men twice her size into wheelchairs, sitting beside lonely veterans while they relived memories they wished they could forget, and helping frightened sons say goodbye to dying fathers beneath fluorescent hospital lights. Yet standing here barefoot on her own front lawn, none of that seemed to matter. Briggs only saw suspicion. "I take care of people," she said quietly. "That is my job." Briggs gave a short, humorless laugh. "Sometimes people hide behind jobs like that." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not out of guilt, but restraint. Her mother used to tell her something when she was young. Never raise your voice just because someone else enjoys hearing it shake. So Naomi inhaled slowly and kept her tone calm. "You have 10 police cars outside the home of a nurse caring for her sick father," she said softly. "If there is evidence against me, show it." For the first time, Briggs' jaw tightened slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. But Naomi did. Officer Briggs held Naomi's gaze for several long seconds, while rainwater rolled slowly off the edge of his cap and onto the concrete below. Around them, the neighborhood remained unnaturally still except for the low hum of police engines and the occasional crackle of static from nearby radios. Naomi could feel eyes watching from every darkened window on Maplewood Drive. Some curious, some nervous, some already judging her before hearing a single fact. Briggs finally pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his vest and held it up without offering it to her. "Anonymous tip came in at 11:43 tonight," he said. "Male suspect, former Navy SEAL, considered highly dangerous. Witness claims he entered this property through the back alley less than an hour ago." Naomi frowned in disbelief. "That is impossible." Briggs ignored the interruption. Witness also reported hearing military code language through an open window. One officer behind him shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable repeating the accusation out loud. Naomi almost laughed from exhaustion alone. Military code language. The only voices inside her house tonight had been her father coughing and the old jazz station quietly playing in the kitchen while she reheated canned soup after work. Briggs stepped closer to the gate, lowering his voice slightly. "You want to tell me why your home suddenly became connected to a missing special operations officer?" Naomi stared at him steadily despite the humiliation burning inside her chest. "Because someone lied." Briggs tilted his head. "You seem very sure for somebody under investigation." Naomi folded her arms against the cold wind brushing across the soaked street. "I spent 14 hours tonight helping veterans with spinal injuries relearn how to hold a spoon," she said quietly. "Then I came home to give my father his medication. That is what happened in this house." Briggs studied her face carefully, like he expected cracks to appear if he stared long enough. But Naomi had spent too many years surviving hard moments quietly. Her composure came from practice, not confidence. Another weak, coughing fit drifted from the hallway inside the house. This time one of the younger officers glanced uneasily toward the front door. Naomi noticed immediately. "He needs his medication within the hour," she said softly. "Please let me check on him." Briggs did not move. "Nobody enters or exits until we clear the property." Naomi's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all night. "You are punishing a sick old man over a rumor." We are securing a possible federal threat by surrounding a nurse's house with rifles. The younger officer looked down at the pavement. Briggs' expression darkened. Careful, he warned quietly. Naomi could feel the entire street listening now. Rain dripped steadily from the roof gutters beside her, while flashing lights washed over her small front porch again and again like waves. Then suddenly a nearby voice cut through the tension. Sir, one officer called while jogging toward Briggs from the far side of the yard. We checked the back fence and neighboring properties. No footprints. No forced entry. Nothing so far. Briggs barely looked at him. Keep searching. Yes, sir. The officer hesitated before stepping away. Naomi saw it again in several faces nearby now. Uncertainty. Doubt beginning to spread quietly beneath the authority holding the scene together. Briggs sensed it too. That was when his tone changed. Colder. Sharper. More personal. Funny thing is, he said slowly while staring directly at Naomi. People in neighborhoods like this usually cooperate when law enforcement shows up. But you seem more interested in protecting somebody. Naomi felt the insult beneath the words immediately. So did the young officer standing 3 feet away. Silence settled heavily across the lawn. Naomi inhaled slowly through her nose and looked Briggs directly in the eye. No, she said softly. I am interested in protecting my father from being terrified in his own home. The silence after Naomi's words lingered across the front yard like heavy fog. Rain tapped steadily against the roofs of parked cruisers while blue and red lights swept across the wet pavement in endless circles. Officer Briggs looked at her without speaking, his jaw flexing slightly beneath the glow of the emergency lights. He was no longer dealing with someone frightened enough to fold under pressure, and that seemed to irritate him more than open resistance would have. Naomi could feel it in the way his eyes narrowed each time she answered calmly instead of emotionally. Behind her, another sharp coughing fit came from inside the house, followed by the faint sound of something falling against a wall. Naomi's body reacted before her mind did. She turned halfway toward the front door instinctively. Dad, she called softly. No answer came back. Her chest tightened immediately. Briggs stepped sideways, blocking the gate before she could move. Nobody goes inside, he said flatly. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. My father can barely stand on his own. That is unfortunate. The coldness of the reply made even the younger officer nearby glance away uncomfortably. Naomi took one slow breath, forcing herself not to let panic rise into her voice. She had seen enough medical emergencies to know fear solved nothing. His medication is on the kitchen counter, she said carefully. If he falls, he could hit his head. Please let me help him. Briggs folded his arms. We are still securing the property. Naomi looked past him toward the cluster of officers moving flashlights across her windows. One of them opened the backyard gate, while another circled toward the garage. The humiliation of strangers searching through her life, while neighbors watched from dark windows, settled over her like cold rainwater soaking into fabric. Maplewood Drive had known Naomi for years. They knew she carried groceries for elderly neighbors. They knew she worked double shifts during flu season without complaint. They knew she spent every 4th of July sitting beside her father on the porch because loud fireworks triggered painful memories from his military service decades earlier. Yet tonight none of that mattered against the image created by flashing police lights and tactical vests. Briggs suddenly motioned toward the front lawn. Stay there. Naomi frowned. What? You heard me. He pointed toward the wet grass near the sidewalk where officers could keep a direct view on her from every angle. Until we finish clearing the residence. Naomi looked at the soaked patch of lawn, then back at him. You want me standing in the rain while my father is alone inside? Briggs did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward several neighbors openly recording with cell phones now from behind their curtains. Naomi understood the moment instantly. This was no longer just about investigation. It was about control, about making an example. The younger officer stepped closer to Briggs and lowered his voice. Sir, maybe we should allow her to check on the father while an officer accompanies her. Briggs barely turned his head. Did I ask for suggestions? The officer immediately fell silent. Naomi slowly stepped onto the wet grass anyway, her slippers sinking slightly into the muddy ground beneath her feet. Cold rain dampened the ends of her curls while flashing lights reflected across the puddles gathering near the curb. Somewhere nearby, a porch door opened quietly before closing again. People were watching everything now. Briggs kept his eyes fixed on Naomi like he expected her patience to crack eventually. But instead she wrapped her arms tightly against the cold and stood still beneath the storm of lights surrounding her home. Then softly, almost to herself, she said, "You still have not shown me any evidence." Briggs stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Maybe because people like you are better at hiding it than most." The words landed harder than the rain. The insult lingered in the cold rain between them, ugly and unmistakable. Naomi felt several officers nearby go quiet at the same time, their faces tightening beneath the flashing lights as Officer Briggs' words settled over the lawn. Somewhere across the street, a porch light snapped off suddenly, but she could still feel people watching through their curtains. Her father coughed again inside the house, weaker now, followed by the faint scrape of furniture against the floor. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Every instinct inside her wanted to push past the officers and run to him, but she knew exactly how quickly that movement could be twisted into something else tonight. So she stayed still. Rainwater slid slowly down the side of her face while the soaked grass chilled her feet through her slippers. "You do not know anything about me," she said quietly. Briggs stepped closer until only the small iron gate separated them. "I know enough," he replied. "Single woman. Quiet house. Night shifts. Military hospital connections. Those are facts." Naomi looked directly at him. "And my skin color helped complete the story for you." The younger officer nearby lowered his eyes immediately. Briggs' expression hardened. "Do not play that card with me." "I did not play anything," Naomi answered softly. "You already decided who I was before you knocked on my door." A tense silence followed. Rain drummed against the hoods of the cruisers while radios crackled faintly somewhere near the sidewalk. Then suddenly a voice called out from inside the house. Weak, fragile, barely loud enough to carry through the storm. "Naomi." Her father sounded confused and frightened. Naomi's entire body stiffened. "Dad, stay where you are," she called gently toward the open doorway. "I am right here." A flashlight beam moved through the hallway inside the house. One officer emerged onto the porch and looked toward Briggs. "Sir, we cleared the downstairs." No sign of anyone. Briggs frowned immediately. "Check again." "We already did." "Then check the attic." Naomi stared at him in disbelief. "You are tearing through my house because you cannot admit you are wrong." Briggs ignored her completely. Another officer approached carrying Naomi's old photo album in gloved hands before awkwardly placing it back onto a side table just inside the doorway. Naomi saw the embarrassment on the man's face immediately. They were searching through family memories now. Hospital bills. Medication schedules. Her father's military records framed along the hallway wall. All of it exposed beneath flashing lights and suspicious eyes. Then one officer near the driveway lifted something from the ground beside the garbage bins. "Sir," he called. "Found a boot print." Briggs immediately turned. Naomi followed their gaze toward the muddy patch beside the side fence. A dark partial footprint pressed into the wet dirt near the alley entrance. Briggs looked back at Naomi slowly, victory creeping into his expression for the first time all night. "Still think we are here by mistake?" Naomi stared at the print for several seconds. Then quietly she said, "That alley is shared by 6 houses." Briggs smirked faintly. "Interesting how fast you noticed that." Naomi folded her arms tighter against the cold. "Because I live here." Briggs stepped closer again. "You know what I think?" he asked softly. Naomi did not answer. "I think somebody warned you before we arrived. I think whoever was hiding here slipped out minutes before my officers locked this street down." Naomi could hardly believe what she was hearing anymore. "You are inventing a story because you need one." Briggs leaned nearer to the gate, lowering his voice enough that only she and the nearest officers could hear him. "No," he said coldly. "I think people like you survive by pretending innocence, while smarter people clean up the mess afterward." Naomi looked at him for a long moment beneath the pouring rain. Then finally, very calmly, she said, "I want to make a phone call." The request seemed to catch everyone off guard for a moment. Rain continued falling steadily across Maplewood Drive, while red and blue lights rippled through the puddles gathering near the curb. Officer Briggs stared at Naomi with open suspicion now, his eyes narrowing slightly beneath the brim of his rain-darkened cap. "A phone call?" he repeated. Naomi nodded once. Water dripped from the sleeves of her sweatshirt while cold wind pushed damp curls against her cheeks. "Yes." Briggs gave a short laugh under his breath and glanced toward the other officers nearby, as if the request itself amused him. You think somebody is coming to rescue you? Naomi held his gaze calmly. No, she answered softly. I think somebody deserves to know what you are doing. The words settled heavily across the lawn. One officer near the driveway looked away immediately, while another shifted uncomfortably beside the porch steps. Briggs studied Naomi for several long seconds before finally extending one gloved hand toward her. Phone. Naomi slowly reached into the pocket of her sweatshirt and handed it over without argument. Briggs checked the screen first, then stepped slightly away while scanning through recent calls. Naomi watched silently beneath the rain while her father's weak coughing echoed faintly from somewhere inside the house. Every minute that passed tightened something painful in her chest, but she refused to let Briggs see panic. That was exactly what he wanted now. Control had become personal for him. Finally, Briggs walked back toward the gate and held the phone out loosely between two fingers. One call, he said. Speaker on. Naomi accepted the phone carefully with cold fingers. The screen glowed pale against the darkness around her while raindrops gathered across the cracked corner of the case. She hesitated only briefly before scrolling to a single number buried deep in her contacts under one name. Ethan. Briggs noticed immediately. That your fugitive? Naomi ignored him and pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Briggs smirked faintly. Around them the rain seemed louder suddenly, drumming against rooftops and police hoods in restless waves. Naomi lowered the phone slightly, staring at the dark screen for half a second before raising it again. Then finally the call connected. A calm male voice answered immediately. Naomi. The entire lawn seemed to pause. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the sound of the familiar voice. I am sorry to call this late, she said quietly. They are here. Silence answered her for one heartbeat too long. Then the man's tone changed completely. Sharper. Controlled. Dangerous in a quiet way that did not need volume to carry weight. Who is there? Naomi looked toward Briggs. Local police, she answered. They surrounded the house. Briggs crossed his arms, unimpressed. Tell your friend to save the drama. Naomi ignored him again. They say they are searching for a missing Navy SEAL. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Even Briggs stopped smiling slightly. The voice on the phone became very still. Put the officer in charge on the line. Briggs immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. Naomi did not move. He wants to speak with you. Briggs laughed openly now, though it sounded thinner than before. I do not take orders from random men on telephones at 2 in the morning. Naomi slowly raised the phone back to her ear. He refuses. The voice on the other end remained calm. Too calm. All right, the man said quietly. Then listen carefully. Do not say anything else. Do not let them intimidate you. I am already on my way. Naomi lowered the phone slowly. Briggs watched her face carefully. What now? He asked sarcastically. Naomi slipped the phone back into her pocket. Rainwater rolled steadily from the edge of the roof beside her while thunder rumbled low in the distance. Then softly, without anger, without fear, she answered, Now you wait. At first, nothing happened. Rain continued falling across Maplewood Drive in soft, relentless sheets, while police lights flashed silently against the dark windows of sleeping homes. Officer Briggs stood near the gate with the same smug expression, though Naomi noticed something different now beneath it. Restlessness. He checked his watch once. Then again 30 seconds later. The younger officers had grown quieter too. Radios crackled less. Conversations stopped midway. The entire street felt suspended inside a strange, uneasy pause. Naomi remained standing alone on the soaked lawn with her arms folded tightly against the cold, her slippers half buried in wet grass. She could feel exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body after the long hospital shift and the endless tension of the night. But somehow she also felt calmer now than she had since the cruisers first arrived. Inside the house, her father had finally stopped coughing. The silence worried her, but the sound of that voice on the phone still echoed steadily in her mind. I am already on my way. Then suddenly, every police radio on the scene erupted at once. Sharp bursts of overlapping voices crackled through the humid night air. Officers instinctively reached for their shoulders as dispatch transmissions poured through in rapid confusion. Unit 7 confirmed command authorization. Negative. Repeat negative. Federal vehicles entering perimeter. Briggs immediately grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Sergeant Briggs. Clarify federal involvement. Static answered first. Then a tense voice finally responded. Stand by, Sergeant. Briggs' jaw tightened visibly. Headlights appeared at the far end of Maplewood Drive seconds later. Not police cruisers. Black SUVs. Large. Silent. Moving with controlled speed through the rain. Every officer on the lawn turned at the same time as the vehicles rolled slowly past the line of local patrol cars. Their dark paint reflected the flashing emergency lights like black water beneath a storm. The first SUV stopped directly in front of Naomi's house. The engine shut off. For one long second, nobody moved. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark waterproof jacket over military khakis. Early 40s. Broad shoulders. Close-cut hair streaked slightly with gray at the temples. Calm eyes that swept across the scene once and seemed to understand everything immediately. Naomi exhaled softly the moment she saw him. Ethan Hayes closed the SUV door behind him without urgency. That was somehow the most unsettling part. He did not look angry. He looked certain. Two additional men stepped from the second SUV, carrying federal credentials clipped beneath their jackets. Briggs straightened immediately, forcing authority back into his posture. This is an active local investigation, he announced loudly while stepping toward the curb. Ethan ignored him completely at first. His eyes moved past the officers, past the flashing lights, past the soaked lawn until they landed on Naomi standing barefoot in the rain. Something shifted across his expression then. Not shock, not confusion, recognition, respect. He walked directly toward the gate while officers instinctively stepped aside without being asked. Naomi suddenly became aware of how she must look. Exhausted, shivering, humiliated beneath the eyes of an entire neighborhood. Ethan stopped just outside the gate and looked at her carefully. Are you hurt? He asked quietly. Naomi shook her head once. No, Ethan glanced toward the house. Your father? Inside. Ethan nodded slowly, then finally turned toward Briggs for the first time. The temperature of the entire scene seemed to drop instantly. Who authorized this operation? He asked calmly. Briggs lifted his chin defensively. Sergeant Daniel Briggs. Local intelligence suggested this residence was connected to a missing Navy SEAL. Ethan stared at him without expression. Rain slid down the shoulders of his jacket, while distant thunder rolled softly overhead. Connected? He repeated quietly. Briggs crossed his arms. We received credible information. Ethan looked back toward Naomi, standing silently beneath the rain. Then his eyes returned to Briggs again. The woman you surrounded with 10 police cars, he said softly, once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire while most men twice her size froze in place. The entire street went silent. No one spoke after Ethan's words. Rain fell softly across the street while flashing police lights reflected in long streaks along the wet pavement. Officer Briggs stood completely still near the gate, but the confidence that had carried him through the night was gone now. Naomi saw it clearly in the way his shoulders stiffened and his jaw tightened beneath the cold glow of the cruiser lights. Around him, officers exchanged uncertain glances while the federal agents remained calm beside the black SUVs, hands folded in front of them like men who already understood how this night would end. Ethan stepped through the gate slowly and stopped beside Naomi on the rain-soaked lawn. Up close, she could see faint scars along his hands disappearing beneath the cuffs of his jacket, reminders of years neither of them ever talked about anymore. You should not be standing out here in this weather, he said quietly. Naomi managed a tired smile despite everything. I tried explaining that. Ethan's eyes moved briefly toward the house. Your father needs medical attention? His medication is inside. Ethan nodded once, then turned toward one of the federal agents standing near the SUVs. Get the house secured and have somebody assist Mr. Carter immediately. Yes, sir. Two agents moved toward the porch at once, calm and respectful in a way that immediately contrasted with the chaos that had swallowed the property earlier. Briggs stepped forward quickly. Hold on, he said sharply. This is still my scene. Ethan looked at him evenly. Not anymore. The words landed without volume, yet somehow carried more force than any shout all night. Briggs lifted his chin defensively. We received a legitimate report involving a missing military operative. Ethan studied him carefully for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a thin black folder sealed beneath rain droplets. He handed it toward Briggs without hurry. "The operative you were searching for," Ethan said calmly, "was recovered 3 hours ago outside Charlotte." Briggs frowned while opening the folder beneath the flashing lights. Naomi watched the color slowly drain from his face as he scanned the paperwork inside. "That is impossible," he muttered. Ethan remained expressionless. "No. What is impossible is believing 10 patrol units surrounding a nurse caring for a disabled veteran father was ever reasonable police work." The younger officer standing near the sidewalk lowered his eyes immediately. Briggs looked up again, searching for footing that no longer existed beneath him. "We had evidence." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "A partial footprint in shared mud and an anonymous phone call are not evidence. They are excuses." Silence spread across the yard again. Naomi suddenly realized many of the neighbors were no longer hiding behind curtains now. Several stood openly on their porches watching everything unfold beneath the rain and flashing lights. Briggs noticed it too. Public humiliation had changed directions. One of the federal agents approached Ethan quietly holding a small tablet. "Sir, we traced the anonymous report." Ethan glanced at the screen briefly before handing it directly toward Briggs. "Recognize the name?" Briggs stared at the display and said nothing. Naomi could not see the screen clearly from where she stood, but she recognized the reaction instantly. Fear. Real fear this time. Ethan finally answered for him. "Elaine Mercer," he said quietly. "The same neighbor Miss Carter reported 6 months ago for abusing her elderly husband." Naomi blinked in surprise. Ethan looked back toward her briefly. "She filed 3 complaints against you afterward. All dismissed." Briggs closed the folder slowly, rain dripping from its edges onto the grass below. "I did not know that." Ethan's eyes hardened for the first time all night. "You should have." Another long silence followed while thunder rolled faintly across the distance. Then softly, almost exhausted now, Briggs finally looked toward Naomi standing barefoot in the rain. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "it appears mistakes were made tonight." Naomi stared at him for several seconds beneath the flashing lights and falling rain. Then quietly she answered, "No, Sergeant. Choices were made tonight." By the time the first hint of sunrise touched the clouds above Maplewood Drive, the rain had finally begun to ease. The flashing police lights that had drowned the neighborhood in red and blue for hours disappeared one by one as patrol cars slowly pulled away from the curb in heavy silence. No sirens, no shouting, just engines fading into the wet early morning air. Neighbors who had spent the night peeking through curtains now stood quietly on their porches wrapped in robes and blankets, watching the scene dissolve with the same uneasy stillness that had settled over the entire street. Naomi sat on the front steps beneath the porch light with a dry blanket draped around her shoulders. Her damp curls rested against her cheeks while exhaustion weighed visibly across her face. But for the first time all night her breathing had finally slowed. Inside the house, one of the federal agents had helped her father back into bed after making sure he took his medication safely. The old man had fallen asleep almost immediately, worn out by confusion and stress he never should have endured in the first place. Through the open doorway, Naomi could hear the faint hum of his oxygen machine blending softly with the low creak of the ceiling fan in the hallway. Familiar sounds. Safe sounds. Ethan stood near the sidewalk speaking quietly with the remaining federal agents while the last local officers cleared the scene. Officer Briggs remained beside his cruiser holding his cap beneath one arm, staring down at the wet pavement as though trying to understand how the night had collapsed around him so completely. The arrogance that once carried him through the neighborhood was gone now, washed away somewhere between the rain, the federal vehicles, and the truth he never bothered to look for before pointing suspicion at a tired black nurse standing barefoot in her own yard. After several moments, Briggs finally walked slowly toward the porch. Naomi looked up, but did not stand. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his voice quieter than she had heard all night. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "there will be an internal review after this." Naomi said nothing at first. Briggs glanced briefly toward the neighboring houses, where people still watched from porches and windows. Public memory had already started forming around the scene. He knew that now. "For what it is worth," he added stiffly, "your father deserves better than what happened tonight." Naomi studied him silently for several seconds while cool morning air drifted through the street, carrying the scent of rain-soaked grass and wet pavement. Then finally she answered in the same calm voice she had carried through the entire night. "So does every person you decide to fear before you understand them." Briggs lowered his eyes briefly. He nodded once without another word and walked back toward his cruiser. Naomi watched him leave in silence. Across the yard, Ethan approached the porch slowly, stopping near the crooked American flag that had fallen sideways during the search hours earlier. Without speaking, he bent down, lifted the small flagpole carefully from the wet grass, and pressed it firmly back into the ground beside the walkway. The fabric fluttered softly in the cool dawn breeze, damp but standing upright again. Naomi looked at him and managed a faint, tired smile. "You drove all the way from Charlotte for this?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward the house behind her. "You once stayed awake for 36 straight hours to keep wounded Marines alive after a convoy attack," he replied. "I figured I owed you the drive." Naomi looked down at her hands resting beneath the blanket while early sunlight slowly began pushing through the clouds overhead. The street was almost quiet now. No flashing lights, no radios, no accusations, just the soft rustling of trees and the distant sound of birds beginning to wake with the morning. Ethan sat down quietly beside her on the porch steps. Neither of them spoke again for a while. They simply watched the sunrise spread slowly across Maplewood Drive while the last puddles reflected gold instead of red and blue.